Very special thanks to Cars of Somerset, of course, for providing the Golf in this review. And of course, if you want to check out this vehicle's specs and info and the many things that have been done to it, then check out the link right below this video in the description. And it's all listed there, as well as, of course, the rest of their stock. And if there's something that you see in one of my reviews that you would like to purchase, but it's already gone, then you can even commission them to find you one across the UK as well. The stakes when entering this review are among the highest of an episode so far, apart from perhaps when I drive a new Maserati model on the channel, and that is because, for those who don't know, I relatively recently reviewed the Mark V Golf R32. Also modified, just like this one, not to this level, but modified nonetheless, with I believe it was a Miltech exhaust, lowered, carbon chin splitter, supercharged to about 350 horsepower, and, spoiler alert if you haven't watched that episode already, which you really should, it's one of my favourite cars I've ever driven in Beards and Cars. It was legitimately that good and that fun in every way, especially for the kind of prices you can pick up an R34 for. This is a very different animal to that R32, and it's not the first time I've compared a newer to older Volkswagen. I drove the newer shaped Touareg and compared it to my older Touareg with the V10 engine, so this is kind of a recurring theme of this series, older versus newer Volkswagens. But when it comes to the Golf R, of course, it's more apt to compare this one to the Golf 6R than it is to a Mark V R32. Now, I'm still going to make some comparisons to that car because to me, that one is the pinnacle of my Volkswagen experience so far. However, the 6, much like this one, made a big change, and that was moving away from the large capacity, really naturally torquey motor that older one had, and the Mark IV as well, and then moved to a turbo aspirated 2-litre 4-pot, which is what this has again. And the base engine, albeit in a lower state of tune, is also used in the GTI, unsurprisingly, and for those who don't know, Audi's S3 as well. And of course I reviewed the S3 on the channel, so check out that review, of course, if you're in the hot hatch market and are interested in some of the competition. Now, when it comes to this specific car, of course, this one is pretty crazy in comparison, because just like that R32, this is a pretty heavily modified vehicle. In the case of this one, there are way too many things to list, so as I said at the start of the video, check out the description link to see all of the things that have been done to it. But suffice it to say, this is an absolute monster. In the form that I was driving it, with in effect stage 1 mode enabled, running on relatively normal fuel, it's putting out about 520 horsepower. Of course, that's nowhere near stock, and in its stage 3 form, running on richer fuel, etc., it can run up to 580. And according to the previous owner, it's been GPS verified at 0 to 60 in 2.8 seconds. Which for a hot hatch is pretty nuts, and it can run a quarter mile in 10.58 seconds. Now, this particular vehicle in its stock form, of course, is a lot more modest, but it still easily rivals something like a Ford Focus RS, and of course recently I reviewed one of those as well, albeit also tuned to 400 horses. Now, that was a great hot hatch, one of my other favourites so far of the series. This one, though, in its stock form, has a little bit less power, not by much, 296 from that 2-litre engine with 280 pound-feet of torque, which is 380 newton meters for those who prefer that. Now, they did actually update the engine slightly through the model year, around 2016 in particular, because this particular car ran from 2014 to 2020 here in the UK, and that does vary depending on where in the world you are. But in 2016 they updated it from about 296 horsepower to about 306. So not a massive difference, but a slight difference nonetheless. Kind of a Golf 7.5, if you will. Now, this one has another crucial advantage over the Mark 6R, which of course, as I said, also had that 2-litre engine, in as much as this one is the first time we saw a Golf R as a wagon. You can buy this car as a 5-door estate, with that same power plant and similar performance. Another crucial advantage over at least some of its rivals, for those who are interested in it, is that you can 100% buy these with an optional old school manual. A 6-speed manual gearbox, or, in the case of this one that I was driving, the DSG. Once again, the automatic is quicker, surprise surprise, and when I say it's quicker, they are both very, very rapid. The manual version can do 0 to 60 in 5.1 seconds stock. That's just with 296 horsepower, and with the DSG, 4.9. We're literally talking a Golf in standard production form, albeit a high-level model, that can do 0 to 60 about 0.1 of a second slower than what a decade prior would have been something like an Audi RS4 or a BMW M3's performance. And interestingly, that actually harkens back to a point which I made ages ago on the channel, I believe in another review, about how you can tell arguably more about the acceleration of change when it comes to performance cars by looking at hot hatches and super saloons than you can by looking at supercars. Supercars have gotten quicker for sure, but the difference between what makes a hot hatch now compared to what did in the mid-2000s from a Ford Focus ST or an Astra VXR, they're not even comparable these days. Back then, under 7 seconds was serious territory. Now we're talking like GT car territory, and in the case of this one, borderline Tesla acceleration times. Now, with all of that being said, especially with both a 3 and a 5-door variant, with a manual or a DSG, and even with the option of a wagon for those who want it, the question of course arises, for all of its performance, can you genuinely use this as you would typically want a hot hatch or a wagon to be used for, and that is a daily driver? Absolutely yes. Now, one of the things you do need to know is that the official fuel consumption is not even close to what the reality of life is, at least according to the aggregated scores, if you will, that owners actually give these. Now, officially, it'll do 32 to the gallon in a city, 48 on the motorway or the highway, and an average of 40. Not even close. The actual average, at least from what I could find, is lower than all three. You should expect about 30 to the gallon in practice out of this car, but I do have to ask, with that kind of performance, 0 to 60 in 4.9, you do have to wonder if a lot of that economy is because people are using this car as it was intended, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. If that is the case, then averaging 30 to the gallon actually isn't too bad. And if nothing else, it does at least show that you have more practical potential, more economical potential, especially when coupled with a pretty good tax bracket that, for instance, an older, larger engine hatch like an R32 would usually struggle to match. Now, for me, I actually still, for full exposure, prefer the Golf R32 over this one. And I think the reasons why are mostly due to the character of the car rather than what it can do. See, certain vehicles to me are a little clinical in their approach. They're extremely fast, very capable. The prime example, of course, always being the Nissan GT-R, but there are others as well, wherein they tick every single box you could possibly want, and yet so many of us will still find something like a Porsche 911, a Maserati in my case, an Aston Martin perhaps, or even a bare bones option like a Caterham or a Lotus to be more passionate and more characterful and have more fun. To me, that's the core difference between something like this, and I suspect in a similar way at least the Mk7 are as well, compared to that R32. The R32 is not as fast, not as efficient, not as modern. You could even say probably not quite as refined or as good, quote unquote, in many ways. But I still liked it more because it just has so much personality, it was fun, and it almost felt more old school and simple in its approach. And based on the used values of Ford Focus RSs, it seems that the market would agree with me in preferring cars like that to, in comparison, something like the newer all-wheel drive Ford Focus RS in comparison. Now, when it comes to this one, I'm not saying by any stretch that I was disappointed. This is a fantastic little car. Of course, with 520 horsepower, it's going to feel fun, but even stock, those numbers are fantastic. Now, what kind of value should you be looking at, given that the years vary quite a lot? 2014 to 2020 is a pretty big span, especially with an update in there. So at least in England, you should expect to enter the market for one of these at about 13, 14 grand, that kind of territory. And that is for a potentially 6-figure mileage car, or something like a Category D or Category S, that kind of thing. If you want to take that risk, you can. Chances are, if you're going to go for something like this, you're probably going to get one with less miles, maybe fork out a little bit more money, potentially get it on finance or trade something in. So on the upper end, up to like a 2020 car with super low miles, well, you can actually still pay as much as $38,000 for one of these, which sounds nuts for a hot hatch. Again, that's the downside of the technology and the performance increasing year to year. But overall, I think it really is a case of how much you want to spend if you are going to go for a car like this. If you're looking for something modest, you don't care about having like 4-figure miles on the clock, then you should probably be expecting somewhere in the region of like 16 to maybe 22,000 pounds. And I'm sure that will vary quite a bit depending on what country you're in, what market you're in, what year the car is, if it's modified or not, the mileage, all that kind of stuff. Now, speaking of the condition that it's in, I do of course always like to touch on potential issues which you should look out for if you are going to buy one of these. Now, the good thing about this car is that even though I was able to find a small comprehensive list, most of the issues which they can have are far from being crippling, and they're more of a nuisance. And that actually lines up with a lot of things that I've heard from other Volkswagen owners, and even lines up with my ownership experience, albeit with a completely different model, the Touareg V10. So in the case of this car, some earlier models had turbo issues. From what I could find, that seems to be more of a GTI issue than the R, but again, something to look out for in the car's history. Volkswagen also made a couple of curious choices when it comes to its design and the quality of its components, given that of course this was a similar time to some of the scandals that Volkswagen went through, such as having a plastic oil pan, plastic plug for said oil pan, which has to be changed every time as well, and that can actually cause the pan to warp over time due to the changes in temperature because they are plastic. The coolant housing, also plastic, and that can crack over time. So it's kind of some of these interesting choices that could have been done better by Volkswagen, but I'm sure there are a myriad of aftermarket options. Other things about the car which require more of an aftermarket touch, at least if you plan to tune it, include the clutch. The clutch is set up to deal with what the car's already got, but at least from what I could find, if you do plan on running a lot more power, such as this one is, then you will want to upgrade it to a stronger aftermarket component. You'll see some bolt stretching occasionally on the subframe. The way to tell that is having a knocking sound under heavy braking or heavy cornering. Again, not too complex to repair from what I've read, but something to listen and look out for as well. A smaller annoying issue can be the cable and the latch for actually opening the bonnet, or the hood, for our American friends. Again, not the craziest thing in the world, but something which it is known for. The wash fluid sensor can sometimes get things a bit wrong. From my experience, Volkswagen's dashboard being a little bit oversensitive is not too uncommon. And you get a little bit of water ingress, especially around the sunroof, on some of the earlier cars, sometimes the later ones, but due to their age and the mileage, it doesn't tend to be as much of an issue. So ultimately, as I said, none of these issues are crazy. They're certainly not deal breakers, and they shouldn't be for you. If you are considering one of these, I think you'll probably, more likely than not, be happy with it. It offers a massive amount to enjoy. For my taste, it's perhaps a little too understated on the visual side, and in terms of performance, well, this one was phenomenally quick, and even with the stock 296 horses, it's still more than quick enough to worry a super saloon, even some newer super saloons in fact, at 4.9 seconds. But yeah, it's a fantastic sleeper daily driver. My heart lies more with the later 2000s era of Volkswagen, like the Touareg V10s and R50s, the Passat R36 and the Golf R32. That's my kind of era, but when it comes to this one, that newer Touareg that I drove, this newer Golf R, even tangentially the Audi S3, well, they offer a ton to love, a ton to enjoy, and as this car's performance and tuning shows, a pretty colossal amount of potential from those engines as well. So ultimately, check out this one on the website below if you are interested in it. And as I always like to say, if you are a current owner of one, stock or tuned, or if you used to be, maybe if you had an R32 even, or a Mark 6R. Drop your thoughts down below. How do they compare? Any issues or things that you think that potential buyers should know about or look into or preemptively fix before they become a problem. And it goes without saying, of course, that if you are looking to buy one, be sure to check out the comments down below to see what's there. But ultimately, if you want to check out more car reviews on the used market such as this one or the others which I mentioned in this video, of course click around on the channel to find those, and you can find all of my car reviews in one place under the Beards and Cars playlist. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.